And in order to start the shading process, first of all, let's click on this little button here, which enables the Look Dev mode. The Look Dev mode basically adds a lighting setup to the scene, and it will also show us all the properties of the materials when we add materials to our objects. Right now, all these objects don't have materials, that's why they are just gray. So, and if I click on this little arrow up here, and on this ball, I can choose between different lighting setups for my scene. So for example, I can choose this one, and you can see how this changes the lighting in the scene here. And that's really important when you create a material, to check this in different lighting conditions to see if the material works good in different environments basically. So when you create an object for an animation, and while the animation is running, the lighting changes, or you have different scenes with the same objects, you need to make sure that this object always looks good, because the lighting has a big effect on how the object looks, and that's why it is important to check different lighting setups. So let's start with this one here, because this is relatively neutral. And in order to add a material to an object, all you need to do is to click on this little button here to the Material tab. Don't confuse this with the World tab, which looks quite similar. And then click on New to add a new material. First of all, in order to know what material belongs to what object, let's click in here. And let's call it Apple. Then in Blender we are working with so-called shader. Each shader has different properties, and in order to change the shader, you click behind Surface on this principled BSDF. If I click on that, you can see we have a shader list over here. Here we have, for example, a diffuse shader for a simple color, a glossy shader for a reflective material, an emission shader for glowing objects. We also have a mix shader to mix two different shaders together, and so on and so forth. But luckily we don't need that many shaders anymore, because we have this principled shader, which is also enabled by default, because this is basically one kind of Übershader which includes all the other stuff. So basically with this one shader we can create glossy and glass and diffuse materials all in one shader. So basically you don't need to switch anything, because down here we have all the settings for the principled shader, because the principled shader is enabled over here. So now when you look at all the settings down here, this might be a little bit overwhelming, but since we only need a very few of them, you will see that this is actually not that complicated. So let's take a look at the most important settings here for us. First of all, the base color. If I click on this white field, I can change the color and also the brightness. So pretty easy. Then the second most important value is the roughness over here, which defines how rough the surface should appear. So basically this will blur out the reflections in the object. If I set this to 0, as you can see, then we have a perfect smooth reflective surface. And if I set this to a higher value, then you can see this appears to be really rough. So depending on what kind of object you want to create, either a reflective plastic, for example, you use a very low roughness value, or for a concrete ground, you probably use a very high roughness value. Then the next important value is the metallic. So if this value is set to 0, we basically have a non-metallic material. So basically everything which is not metallic. But if we want to create a metallic object, we have to set this value to 1. Then you can see the appearance of the object changed. And if I now play around with the roughness, you can see that this really looks like a metallic apple right now. So also pretty easy. Let's set this back to 0. And the last thing I want to show you here is the transmission value. If I set this to 1, we basically have a glass material. So we have this nice refraction in here. Right now, it's only refracting this image here, which is basically put into the background of our scene and lights up our scene. But this is hidden here in the 3D viewport, so we can't really see it. But we can see it here through the refraction, but we can't see the ground, for example, or the knife in the background. And this we have to enable manually for the viewport, the real-time display of our scene. For that, scroll down here in the material settings, go to settings, and enable screen space refraction. And to make this work in general, we have to go to the render settings, enable screen space reflections. Then you can see we already have this nice real-time reflections on the object. And if I open this app, we also have to enable the refractions. And now, as you can see, also the ground and the knife will be incorporated into the refraction. So let's go back to the material, and that's basically everything. So the base color, metallic, roughness, and transmission. So now I want to show you how to add a simple texture to the object here. So first of all, let's set transmission down to 0. Also metallic should be 0. We just want to have a standard material. And instead of the base color, we want to use the texture. And for that, we click on this little dot behind the color. And here in the textures category, we choose image texture. Now you can see the color will be replaced with the texture. And now we can either open this from our hard drive, create a new plain image, or we can take a look into the library, because every image we load into Blender, no matter it is in the texture paint mode or for the textures or anywhere else, Blender will put the information into an image library and will remember everything we loaded into Blender. So we don't have to import this image once again, because the Apple Paint image is still in here. So simply click on that, and then this will be attached to the base color of this shader. So let's close this, and now you can see this apple has now this nice texture, and this will also display here perfectly in the 3D viewport. So this apple object now has a simple, very flat surface, which is reflective. Certainly we can play around with the roughness here to kind of match the look with a real apple. But what's really missing here are the imperfections. That means that the reflection is not everywhere the same, and maybe we have little bumps here and there on the surface. And this we also can create using our materials. So, but for that, I won't recommend to use this material tab here, because we basically can do everything here. We can add more informations if I click on those dots here. But basically all the information we add will just be listed underneath each other, and then you will just have a long list with a lot of values and you will get totally confused. So I don't recommend to do more than adding a simple texture and changing the base values here. For everything else, we need the shader editor. And for that, we simply go over here to the shading workspace. As you can see here in this shading workspace, we have a different arrangement of windows and editors. Up here we have our 3D window, also with the look dev mode enabled by default. So don't be confused with this little balls here, which is basically just a perfect reflective ball and a white ball, which shows the interaction with the lighting setup, which can be helpful as reference compared to what we create here. But for now, you basically can ignore those. Then over here, we have the file browser open if we want to add textures, but we will do it a bit differently. So we can right click on the edge here and click on join area, and left click on this window to remove this. And down here, we have the image editor enabled, but also we don't need it here. So right click on the edge, join area, and remove it. But what we need here is the shader editor, which is open down here. So if I click on that, you can see the shader editor is enabled. So, and the shader editor is basically just a different way to show everything we set up here in the material tab. So everything I do over here, for example, let's quickly change the roughness, and you will see that the roughness over in the shader editor will change as well, because everything here is basically mirrored over here, just in a different way. Here we use these nodes, and the nodes are driven by input and output. So let's left click somewhere to deselect everything, and then left click and hold to move a node around. This thing here is the texture I've plugged into the base color, and you can see that we have the texture here, Apple Paint, and the color output, so always the stuff on the right side of a node is the output, is plugged into the input on the left side here of this principal shader. So here we have a texture, here we have a shader, and everything which is calculated inside the shader will be outputted over here and will be transferred to the material output node and connected to the surface, which basically means that everything we do here will finally show up on the surface of this selected object. Just for your understanding, everything you see down here or over here is dependent on the selected object. So if I select the ground here, you can see we don't have any material yet. That means over here, nothing will show up. If I select the apple, you can see the connected apple material will show up here and here in the shader editor as well. So, and the shader editor compared to this menu over here is way more clear, since every aspect we add to the node tree here will be clearly visible all the time. So here, for example, if I open the texture settings, it will just be placed somewhere here in between all the other menus and sliders and settings, and it's not really clearly visible what belongs to what. But over here we can see clearly that this is our Apple Paint texture and we know exactly which settings belong to this node here or to this texture. And we can also see very clearly the relationship of this texture to all the other nodes here with the connections. In order to connect or disconnect nodes, you simply left click and hold on an input node, move it out and release your mouse button. Then this will be disconnected. Now you can also see that we still have the texture node, but it's not connected with the base colors. And then we only see the base color we set up here on the final model because this node sends the information to the surface of the object. In order to connect nodes, we left click and hold on an output dot here and simply move the noodle, this line is called noodle, to the input and release your mouse, and then this will be connected. You can also quickly disconnect two nodes by holding down Control, right click and hold and cut this. So this works as well. Then you can see that we have different colors for the input and output. This is also important. Basically, these colors define which nodes we can connect to what other nodes, but this we will learn while we are going.
Okay, so we have our UV image unwrapped, just like we learned before. Things are a little different in Blender 2.8, but we've got that together. And what we did was we switched over here. We went with the scroll wheel and we found the look development mode, which is this one right here, right? And our texture didn't show up, even though it's unwrapped and it's over here in the UV editor. So what we have to do is we have to apply a material. And in Blender 2.8, you have to go down here and find this red material tab. We're going to click New. Now we've got a material on there, but of course, there's something that we still need to do. And we learned about this in the tutorial earlier today. What is that we still need to do? Right? The important settings are color, base color, right? Metallic, roughness, and transmission. What do we need to do to get the image on there? We've learned about this before. We did it the same way before. Anybody in the class know? Tina knows. She has it on there. What do we have to do? Oh, you just changed the color. I got you. Okay. So, guys, to add the color, to add this image on here, you click on this little guy right here. And then you go down to image texture, remember? So go ahead and do that. And you don't need to click open. You can click on this little thumbnail right here. See that? Little picture icon right here? You can go and you can click on that and choose your seamless texture, and there it is. Now there's only one last thing that I want you to pay attention to here today before we talk about the bump map, okay? And that is the mapping and the size. Right here it says flat, box, right? All of these, remember these? This is flat, so we want it mapped flat. However, let's deal with the size now, okay? The size is going to be over here in the UV image editor. So if I go and I select all here, in the, oh, I'm back to, did it bump me back here? No, it didn't. I just need to be able to select all of these. It's because I'm in object mode. So if I go into edit mode here, I will see my vertices here, right? So take a look at your wood. This is a table. I'm going to go and select all of these, and I'm going to hit S. And how do I want this to look as a table? Your decision. You don't want to get too zoomed in, though. Word of warning, because things will be And when we put the bump map on, it won't look right, okay? So I wouldn't leave it right here where it is. You could either make it fine, but things start to look kind of Minecrafty if you go too far there. Or you can go maybe into about, I wouldn't go further than about maybe here. So you don't need to make it look like mine. Choose a size for your texture. And of course, if you don't like the way the texture is going, you can touch R and you can rotate the texture, right? But I'm going to touch R90 and that would rotate it exactly 90 degrees. I actually don't want to do that, so I'm going to go and flip it back. So now I'm going to rotate another 90 degrees. R90, enter. And you can see that they're up and down. You can hit save, and we will deal with the roughness and the bump map tomorrow. Okay? So that's the new way of doing UV textures, just to get them on there. So save that. We'll pick up with that tomorrow.